Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. We are about to commence this evening's event. We ask for your continued cooperation and wish that you have an enjoyable session. For record purposes, please ensure that you are signed in with your full name first, then last name. Necessary changes can be made by clicking on your name, whereby you will be given the option for any alterations. Lastly, we would like to inform you that this event is being recorded for storage and archives. Therefore, to ensure the integrity of our production, we kindly ask for your audio and video functions to be turned off at this time. Thank you once again for joining us this afternoon and for your cooperation. It is now with great pleasure that I hand you over to our research officer.
Thank you for joining us for what is to be our 11th CPALMSI session. Today, I have been given the honor of introducing our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Rajendra Persad. Dr. Persad will be sharing his path to his passion in hematopathology in a 45 minutes presentation entitled Roadmap, a Career in Hematopathology. But before this, I would like to give a brief introduction to the outstanding contributions that Dr. Rajendra Persad has made in the field of hematopathology. Dr. Rajendra Persad is a board-certified hematopathologist in New Jersey and has been holding this position since 2009. Dr. Persad was born in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, where he completed his undergraduate degree in Bachelor of Medicine, Bachelor of Surgery at the University of the West Indies Faculty of Medical Sciences, St. Augustine, Trinidad and Tobago. He then went on to becoming a senior house officer at the Department of Pathology General Hospital, Port of Spain from 1999 to 1997, he then pursued his passion for pathology by attending the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, as an anatomical and clinical pathology resident until 2001. Dr. Rajendra Persad also taught at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine for cardiovascular pathology, renal pathology, and hematopathology from 1999 to 2001. He then joined the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, Texas as a surgical pathology fellow for a year. In 2002, he followed his passion for hematopathology by attending the New York University School of Medicine as a hematopathology fellow for the next year. During 1998-2003, Dr. Persad wrote several articles and digital publications. After this, he returned to Trinidad as the Head Pathology Specialist Medical Officer at the San Fernando General Hospital until 2009. During this time, Dr. Persad published the Overexpression of caspase 3 in hepatocellular carcinoma and Transient atypical monocytosis mimic acute myelomonocytic leukemia in post-chemotherapy patients. Dr. Rajendra Persad has shared his wealth of understanding to our students at the University of the West Indies Doctor of Medicine program from 2005 till present date. He's also a member of the American Society of Clinical Pathologists and the American Society of Hematopathology. Without a doubt, Dr. Rajendra Persad is a motivating figure for us in the MBBS program aspiring hematopathologists and most certainly in pathology. An inspiration to many. We are all honored, pleased, and privileged for him to be here with us this evening. So ladies and gentlemen, I ask where you are to welcome the very knowledgeable and most certainly the very passionate Dr. Rajendra Persad.
Well, thank you very much, Nalini, for that wonderful introduction. I hope I can do it justice. So let me see now if I will share my screen. Can you see me? See my screen now?
It's not up yet. Okay, yes,
No.
it came up.
Let's try that again. Are you seeing the screen now?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So first, being pathologists, we'll start with a case of pathology. So this is the case history. A 67-year-old man who presented to his hematologist for workup for cytopenias, particularly anemia and thrombocytopenia. You'll find often in our field, we don't quite get a full history. His CBC data showed a white count of 5.1, essentially normal, with an absolute neutrophil count of 2.6, again, essentially normal, hemoglobin 7.3, so significant anemia with an MCV of 99 and tending towards the macrocytic side, and a definite thrombocytopenia with a platelet of 81. So the hematopathologist, not having done his usual clinical workup of iron studies, vitamin B12, folic acid, blah, 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 didn't find a clinical reason for the anemia and thrombocytopenia. So proceeded to do a bone marrow with aspirate. The biopsy was unsuccessful. So they provided aspirate material from which we were able to do flow cytometry, morphology, cytogenetics, FISH, and next generation sequencing. So this is a screenshot of one of the pages from his flow cytometry. So basically, flow cytometry involves making a single cell suspension of whatever material you get from the patient, in this case, bone marrow, and staining it with various antibodies. But the cells themselves have inherent characteristics, which when you strike a laser on them, they scatter the light. And they can scatter the light in two directions mainly, where you have two different meters picking up the light that they scatter in what is called the forward direction, which you would see on the lower left of your screen, and side scatter. The forward direction is an indication of the size of the cell, and the side scatter is an indication of the granularity of the cells. The gating strategies, which means where we can separate the cell types, blah, blah, and so on, into their various groups, we use CD45, which is also called the leukocyte common antigen. And here you can see in the gray, myeloid cells, the blue monocytic gate, the red lymphocytic gate, and the green, the blast gate. See that they are somewhat low side scatter, meaning they're not very granular, and CD45 is dim. So some of the antibodies, and we do a panel of antibodies, 28 different antibodies in this panel, CD13, 33, which are myeloid markers, but not specific. They can be seen in lymphoid neoplasms as well. 14 and 64, which are typically monocytic. 16, again, a myeloid marker. HLA-DR, which can be seen on almost anything. CD117, which in hematolymphoid neoplasms is usually an indicator of immaturity. And CD34, again, an indicator of immaturity. In the analysis, you can plot different antibodies against each other so we can see what is co-expressed. For example, in this bone marrow, we see a normal population of blasts, about 1.3%, 1.5%, that HLA-DR and 34 positive, as well as CD117 positive. So nothing striking in this marrow from the flow cytometry. The B cells and T cells were essentially normal. So this forms the bulk of the work as a pathologist, the morphology. This was a very good aspirate, actually, and we can see multiple particles at low power. When you go up to higher power, you can see myeloid lineage, which would be the cells with a little more cytoplasm, some indentation to the nuclei, nuclear huff in some cases, and lots of these somewhat ink blot nuclei, which are the red cell, and these larger cells that are the megakaryocytes. And we don't see really any other significant cell population, no significant lymphocyte or plasma cell population, or carcinoma or any other external to the bone marrow infiltrate. At higher power, this is 400, so typically this would be under oil immersion. we can look closer at the nuclear membrane of the normoblasts. So these are normoblasts. Typically, they're very round cytoplasm with a very round nucleus. This case, you can see that they're not so round, and this nucleus is quite irregular, actually. Here again, another irregular one. There, some budding, almost binucleated. And this one here is a plasma cell in this field. The myeloid cells, they're somewhat hypolobate. By this stage, when the nucleus is so condensed, they should have significant segmentation. And we're not seeing significant segmentation in the myeloid cells. And this would be a promyelocyte, say the nuclear huff, which is called the dawning of neutrophilia. Iron stain was done. Difficult to photograph because what we're looking for are ring sideroblasts with this stain. And here you can see the hint of it. There is in this, let's go back, this field, you can see the blue stain and somewhat granular, and it's around the nucleus where the mitochondria is. Now, to call something a ring sideroblast, you're supposed to see about 5 granules occupying at least a third of the circumference. So something like this. Again, these are difficult to photograph because you look at it in multiple different planes as you focus up and down on the microscope. So from the aspirate as well, we prepare what is called a clot section, in that the aspirate material is left to clot, or fibrin is added and it's made into a clot, and the aspirated particles, which are somewhat intact, can be then fixed and sectioned in paraffin block. So here we see multiple particles, and they are cellular. So it's not as if they're cellularity, it's somewhat subjective, but at least 50%. And this is a 67-year-old general rule of thumb, is that the normal cellularity should be 100 minus the age. So you expect roughly a 30% cellularity. Having said that, in the adult over 50, cellularity normally is around 30%. So even though you have a 90-year-old, you're not going to see, you should not see in a normal 90-year-old 10% cellular bone marrow. That would be on the abnormal side. At higher power, you can see the megakaryocytes. Now, normal megakaryocytes have segmented nuclei. They're not hypolobate as this one, or forming one single large nucleus, or in this one single small nucleus. So those are abnormal. And these are signs of dyspoiesis. So we saw previously this erythropoiesis, meaning dysplasia in the erythroidal lineage, this granulopoiesis, dysplasia in the myeloid lineage, and now we're seeing this megakaryopoiesis, dysplasia in the megakaryocytic lineage. In addition, we saw ring sideroblasts. Now, if you had noticed on this picture, there's this bit of tissue that looks somewhat different. It's paler staining. And when you go up to higher power, you see that these are cells with fairly small nuclei, abundant amphiphilic cytoplasm, and forming clusters, right, adjacent to the megakaryocyte and the what these would be the normoblasts as well. These stain for tryptase by IHC, immunohistochemistry, And you can see some clusters here and single cells elsewhere. So it's seen at least 1, 2, 3, 4 clusters. Here, the single cells, and we can appreciate spindle shape to these cells. Again, that's a tryptase stain by IHC. Higher power with the tryptase, we're seeing 3 aggregates, and you can count these cells with more than 25 in these aggregates. This is CD117, and it's staining those same cells. This is from an area where they're singly separated, but CD117 also stains immature normoblasts and immature myeloid cells as well. So it's probably a little more than we saw with the tryptase, especially these dimmer staining ones. The brighter staining ones are more than likely the mast cells that we picked up with the tryptase stain. This is CD25, which is expressed in some T-cell lymphomas as well. And here it's staining the mast cells as well. So CD25 on mast cells is an aberrant immunophenotype. It's atypical. The cytogenetics, so this is what normal a karyotype, a typical karyotype would look like. Different chromosomes, 1 to 22 on the sex chromosomes. And in this case, they identified loss of the P arm. So we can talk a lot about chromosomes and all that, how we can classify chromosomes based on the location of the centromere, the size, and put them into different groups. So what was found in this case was that all of the metaphases that were analyzed showed that deletion on the short arm of chromosome 12. So what is called deletion 12p, P being for the short arm. And that is seen in myeloid neoplasms. This is a screenshot from the NGS report. And so the genes are listed, the genes that are mutated in this patient are listed in the first column. And then we can see the allele frequency, the variant allele frequency in this column here, third from the right. And ASXL, IDH2, two different ASXL mutations identified, IDH2, SF3 beta 1. Let me go back. ZRSR2, DNMT3A, and TET2. And you'll see that they classify these mutations into tiers. Tier 1 being the most significant, tier 2 being significant and dependent on the clinical setting, and tier 3 being really of uncertain significance. So ASXL1, SF3 beta 1, they are very significant and often seen in myeloid neoplasms. SF3 beta 1 is usually associated with ring sideroblasts, which we saw in this case. And here they basically list them out with telling you what's most significant and what's less significant. So if anyone would be willing to venture a diagnostic category or anything along those lines, feel free to jump in anytime. So systemic mastocytosis. To make that diagnosis, you need to have either one major criterion, which is multifocal dense infiltrates of mast cells, more than 15 in the aggregates, either in sections of some tissue, with one of the minor criteria, or 3 of the minor criteria. In this case, we had the major criterion being fulfilled, and item C of the minor criterion being fulfilled, in that there was CD25 co-expression on the mast cells. So it met criteria for systemic mastocytosis. In addition, we saw trilineage myelodysplasia, so with ring sideroblasts. And in the setting of cytopenia, this is not a quite old patient, but 67-year-old with cytopenias and dysplasia with a cytogenetic finding of deletion 12p would put this in the category of myelodysplastic syndrome, which is a pre-leukemic syndrome, and they quite often progress into acute myeloid leukemia or acute lymphoblastic leukemia in some cases. So there is a category in the 2016 WHO, which was actually recognized since in the late 1990s, of systemic mastocytosis with what is now called associated hematologic neoplasm. Previously, it had a much longer name, systemic mastocytosis with associated clonal hematological non-mast cell lineage disease. I much prefer the shorter name. So if there are any questions about the case, now would be a good time, or we can also do it at any point in time. Feel free to jump in. So what led me to pathology? So when I went into medical school, I had no idea that I would be ending up in hematopathology or even pathology for that matter. Always thought medicine was where you treated patient acutely and they got well, and happy ending to the story all the time. But during my rotations in medical school with Dr. Janki, I fell in love with pathology. And so after graduation, during the internship, there was at that point a 3-month elective. So I chose to spend my 3-month elective. That was when the internship was 18 months, not as it is now, 12 months. So I chose to spend my 3-month elective in pathology. So which I actually established for me that this was the field I wanted to be in. So I spent roughly 2.5 years at Port of Spain General with Dr. Janki under his tutorship. I had learned quite a lot. He's my first mentor in the field of pathology. From there, then the decision was which model of pathology should I go, US, UK, and seeing that, well, that was a personal decision because I had relatives in the US, I chose the US. Ended up in North America, in the Northeast, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Classic steel town, but which was rejuvenating at the point in time from the old coal and steel mills, and they were expanding in the medical field. In fact, by the time I left there, the largest employer in the region was the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. So I knew no one at that point in time who had done pathology in the US. Dr. Janki, Dr. Barrow, everyone else who had done pathology had done it in the UK. So there was very limited information for me in how to go about doing that. And it wasn't easy then to find information. There was no World Wide Web to hop on and get it. Dates me, I guess, so easily. So we had to do it the old-fashioned way. Had to go to the USA library associated with the US Embassy and look up what was then called the Green Books. I don't know if they're still being published, but basically they listed all of the residency programs in the US that were accredited by the ACGME, the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education. I also had to go through the ECFMG to get certified after sitting the USMLE and test of English as a foreign language as well. And then get your visa, which in my case, because I did not have US residency or citizenship, I needed a visa to train, and the one that was available to me was the J1 exchange visitor visa, which required a letter of need from the Ministry of Health in Trinidad, which was a simple thing because at that point in time, and I guess still, there was a need for pathologists. So that is how I applied everywhere in the Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York area, and I was accepted into the Pittsburgh program. One of the things that they were impressed with when I interviewed was the number of autopsies we did in Trinidad, because as you may know, autopsies are not as common in the US as they are in Trinidad. That was followed by a fellowship in what is called selective pathology, but is really surgical pathology. Did everything from breast to heme path in different rotations throughout, and got exposed to a lot of experts in the field. People who have written the WHO fascicles like Stanley Hamilton and so on, Greg Fuller in neuropathology, Hamilton in GI pathology. And at Pittsburgh, I had the great pleasure of working with Stephen Swedlow, who is the lead author of the WHO 2016 monograph on hematopathology. And that was followed by my formal fellowship in hematopathology at NYU under the tutelage of Dr. Giorgio Inghirami, who was very good at the molecular side of things. And after that, having completed what was 6 years of training, at that point in time, pathology training in the US typically required 5 years, 4 years in APCP, plus what was called a one-year credentialing year in any field. So I got credit for the 18-month internship I did in Trinidad. So I was able to sit my board exams after 4 years of pathology residency in Pittsburgh. So I was fortunate in that way, in that I didn't have to do a clinical residency anywhere in the US, just went straight into pathology. So after HemePath fellowship, I returned to Trinidad, went to San Fernando General Hospital. There's quite a difference from what I experienced in training, but I went with my eyes wide open. I knew what I was getting into. There were long backlogs. Specimens were in not the appropriate containers, meaning that you had bleach bottles that were cut to store specimens that were sent over from the operating theaters and so on. I did what I could, and I'm glad to say when I left about 6 years later, I thought things had improved or were improving in a lot of areas. And after fighting for a long time, I eventually was offered a position at this lab I am now, and decided to come back to the US, at which point in time I applied for extraordinary ability visa, which is granted to very few people. And that was how I was able to eventually get citizenship in the US. So that's my story of how I ended up in New Jersey doing hematopathology. So if there are any questions, the floor is open.
Hi, doctor. I'm not too sure if you're seeing the question. What was your score on your summary with that number?
No, I'm not seeing the question. Is it on the chat?
Okay. So if anyone wants to ask a question, they can open their camera or their mic and speak if you would like. For the time being, Dr. Rajendra Persad, could you answer, can you tell us why you specifically chose hematopathology and what or who inspired you to do this?
So, I didn't have a clue when I started medical school that I was going to do pathology. When I started pathology, I didn't have a clue that I was going to do hematopathology. It was only during the rotation in residency when I had the time to spend with Dr. Stephen Swedlow. I saw the integration of morphology with immunophenotyping, molecular cytogenetics. So integration of what was then newer methods. And this is the way that classification of neoplasms are heading. Hematopathology was the first on stream in the classification using genetics along with morphologic criteria to classify neoplasms. And we're seeing it now in the other systems such as the CNS and so on. So that is the wave of the future. And before we had immunohistochemistry, for example, tumors were classified based on the hematoxylin and eosin appearance. And it was good, but there were a number of cases in which you couldn't distinguish tumors that look alike, and sometimes tumors from reactive conditions, neoplasms from reactive conditions as well. But hematopathology was at the forefront, and I appreciated the integration of multiple modalities of testing. And I think we can come to a clearer understanding of the disease and the disease process and what to expect when we have all of that information in one place. And that is where the pathologist comes in. I know in the UK system, the hematopathologist is really a clinician who diagnoses and treats. But I am not one who cares too much for the treatment aspect, so which means that the US system where the diagnostic aspect of hematopathology is fully within the realm of pathology, in that we don't see patients, and that is left to the hematologists and oncologists.
Thank you so very much for answering my question. Anyone else would like to ask Dr. Prasad any questions? You can speak up. You can unmute your mic and speak. Okay, the next question that I would like to ask you. So where do you see this field of hematopathology in the future?
Well, hematopathology is far advanced along the route of classification based on genetics. And I think what has happened to hematopathology, which going back to 1994 from the real classification, the revised European American lymphoma classification, which integrated not just the morphology, but the clinical aspects and the genetics. That was basically the first formulation of a classification of neoplasms that integrated everything and came up with distinct disease processes that could be followed. And, you know, it was important in medical trials to separate out different disease processes. And the field of hematopathology is becoming more data intensive in that all of these NGS mutations now, which are still being sorted out in the clinical significance. And as we get more experience with them, they would become more important. But the essence of pathology to me still is that H&E stained glass slide, which I showed some pictures of. And I don't see that going away anytime soon, because at the end of the day, even if a patient bears a mutation, that does not necessarily mean that the patient bears a tumor or cancer at that point in time. It may increase their risk, but it does not mean that they have a tumor or cancer that requires treatment. So, like in our case, if we had detected those mutations, but we didn't see the morphologic dysplasia or the mastocytosis, they would then have to be classified as uncertain significance. And the patient would have to be followed up before we can say for certain what the diagnosis is. So yes, NGS genetics is becoming more and more important, but it has not yet replaced, and for the foreseeable future will not replace the H&E stained requirement for diagnosis. But solid tumors, sarcomas, glioblastomas, oligodendrogliomas in the central nervous system, those as well have come along in that certain translocations are important in their diagnosis as well. So I see the rest of the field of pathology generally going along the route of hematopathology in integrating these genetics as part of the classification of neoplasms.
Thank you for that information. So Alicia Wallace, she has her hand up. I don't know if you would like to unmute.
Yes, hi, good night, everyone. I would just like to ask more about your experience on return from training to Trinidad. You said it was a little bit of a fight because my intention is forensic pathology, and my intention is actually to return to Trinidad after training. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more on your experience returning from training to get integrated into our system here.
So to get integrated into the system wasn't too hard because I kept in contact. I would return every year while I was training, and I would visit with Dr. Janke at Port of Spain. So I kept up to date with what was going on in the field of pathology in Trinidad. And my 2.5-year experience as a house officer as well I knew full well what situation I was coming back into. So the level of facilities that were available, for example, the mortuary at the San Fernando General Hospital was dilapidated, and for example, you don't have enough air exchanges to make it a safe room. On my very second day of employment at San Fernando General Hospital, my first letter went out to the administration because the grossing room, which, as you may be aware, the grossing room, the specimens come in formalin, and we have to open the containers, take them out, and dissect them. And unless there is appropriate ventilation in the room, you're overwhelmed with the formalin fumes. And as you may know, formalin is a carcinogen. In addition to the acute irritation of the mucous membranes that result, we had one little 6x6 extractor fan in the room, which was just not doing its job. So that was one thing from the second day. The specimen that was stored in the room were not in appropriately sealed containers, because you can imagine if you cut open a bleach bottle and put a specimen in it, that can never be closed to prevent the leakage of formalin. So I was going from a system of training where we had a lot of digital information, in that there was an electronic medical record that you could access from your PC on your desk. There was not that in Trinidad. I understand things have moved along somewhat since I left in 2009, in that you can access some of that in some of the places. But our requests for pathology used to come in sheets of paper that were roughly cut into 4 and scribbled like a prescription pad. And in addition, the reports that went back to the physicians, the surgeons, clinicians, they were written again on, they were typed on half a page. So here you may have a diagnosis, for example, let's say breast cancer, colon cancer, prostate cancer. The most important piece of information for this patient is literally on a scrap of paper stuck somewhere into the notes. So those were challenges that we faced, in addition to the routine challenges of how do you maintain a supply system, and to maintain the continuous supply of reagents so that you're not short of reagents at the end of the fiscal year. I think that's a continuing challenge, and I don't understand why that should continue to be a challenge in 2021 for a country such as Trinidad, which is blessed with many resources. So I foresee that for those who are returning to Trinidad, that there will be those challenges. I don't know the exact situation in the Forensic Science Center, but the last I checked, they are also deficient in their physical infrastructure, so that the air changes in the autopsy room do not meet international standards, for example. And these things are becoming more important now with the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, Trinidad now has a policy of not doing routine autopsies on patients who've been tested positive for COVID-19, but they do medical legal autopsies on those patients, but otherwise not. So one can imagine if you had a proper physical facility, in addition to proper personal protective equipment, for example, powered air purifiers for the pathologists and the DNAs, you can safely conduct a COVID-19 autopsy. But without that, it's not safe, and the risk to the staff is just not acceptable at this time. So there will be many challenges. This is not to deter you, but it might, in fact, hopefully excite you to make changes. And I think I did my part in improving some things at San Fernando. And so hopefully that will give you the impetus to get your training, come back and make use of your knowledge in facilitating change, positive change.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that response.
So I would like to show you the screen on the feedback in which we got about the session that we had with you today. So this is what we're seeing. You see my screen?
Not yet.
So you're getting informative, interesting, sweet, educational, concise, enjoyed it thus far, inspiring, heart-stringing, very informative and inspirational.
Curious as to the sweet.
I'm curious as well if the person who spoke this would like to give us a little bit of information. I guess that's why we do it anonymously.
So I must say that I enjoy what I do. And I think that's a fundamental part of choosing your specialty, to enjoy what you do and recognize the contribution you can make to patient care. Because at the end of the day, that's the most important thing that we do. We don't see the patients face to face, but some of the diagnoses that we make critically impact the patient. In fact, it can be the most important single piece of information for the patient in many cases. And so the importance of what we do as pathologists cannot be underemphasized. In fact, some people have described the Department of Pathology as the central nervous system of a hospital, without which there would be no functioning of the hospital system. And I agree with that to a great extent.
Well, thank you so very much. So as we come to the end of the event, I hope you all had a wonderful and learning experience. At this time, the feedback form link has been sent and we would like you to take a few minutes to fill it out. It will be greatly appreciated for documentation and for improvements to our future events. I would just give one last call for anyone that would like to give any questions at all to Dr. Rajendra. Okay, so Alfredo Nobel once said, "My home is where I work and I work everywhere." Firstly, I'd like to thank our featured speaker, Dr. Rajendra Persad, for who, despite his busy schedule, graced us this evening with an inspiring, amazing, and enlightening presentation, where we were all extremely grateful to learn about a career in hematopathology. Thus, we are most happy that you were able to give us an insight to the road map of hematopathology. We are hopeful that your audience was able to take pertinent notes and was reminded, if not educated, on the importance of hematopathology. We would also like to extend our gratitude to Dr. Alfredo Walker, our advisory board member, for joining us with your presence this evening. We appreciate your endless support and thank you for playing a key role in supporting us throughout our journey thus far. We thank you all for taking your valuable time, effort, and consideration in the investment to nurture and properly establish a future of pathology. It is not only an act of success, but one of greatness, showing us the paths that you have walked. I would also like to recognize Dr. Corsi for taking the time off your schedule and joining us. Thank you so very much. Last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you for all for accompanying us tonight and making our event a success. And we look forward to your continued support. To all of our UE students and staff across 3 campuses at the University of Ottawa and Eastern Ontario Laboratory Regional Association, and especially to our specially invited guests, thank you, thank you, thank you. Next, CPALMSI featuring Dr. Dina L. de Melawi, Ottawa Children's Hospital, Eastern Ontario, who will deliver a 45-minute talk on a career in pediatric and perinatal pathology. Ladies and gentlemen, this marks the end of our session this evening. Thank you all for joining us for this our 11th installment of CPALMSI and hope to see you at our future event. Good evening, everyone.